Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Mr. Robot Season 2, Episode 6, Slave Master. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Mr. Robot, so I'll have to give a spoiler warning for Mr. Robot up to Season 2, Episode 6. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, I gotta be honest here, this episode was definitely my least favorite of the season so far. I'm not sure that filler is the right word for it. I think I'd use the term fluff. This episode had a lot of fluff, and what I mean by that distinction is that filler tends to imply the episode had a lot of scenes that didn't add anything to the overall story, where the scenes in this episode totally did add to the overall story. They just took way too long to get there, and they didn't need to be that long, as I strongly believe you could have conveyed the same information that this episode contained in 55 minutes and like 15 or at least 20 minutes and still maintain good quality and not have it feel like it was rushed. This episode just went way longer than it needed to, so I call it fluff. At the start of the season, when I heard that they were having 12 episodes this season instead of 10, I was excited because I thought we'd get more story, but apparently not. Apparently they just wanted more time so they could waste it fluffing around and apparently tell a story that could be told in the 7 episodes in 12 instead. Of course, the season's not finished yet, so I don't know for sure yet, but it's really starting to look that way. And as much as I absolutely love the style of the show and would say that by far it's one of the strong suits of the show, this episode was clearly an example of style over substance, as it did very, very, very little to push the overall story forward. So let's start with the opening scene in the 80s sitcom version. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here to talk about a little pet peeve of mine, and that's when people get the 80s and the 90s style confused and call what is very clearly 80s style 90s. This happened in a popular YouTube video where the Game of Thrones opening was reimagined according to the title of that video as a 1995 version, when that opening was very clearly 80s style. Now, this was an argument that raged on the comment section, and many defending it compared it to the syndicated show The Highlander that aired in the 90s and said that it was very much like that, so it's 90s styles. But I would argue that despite the fact that that show aired in the 90s, it was still 80s style, as if you look at the majority of shows in the 90s, like The X-Files, Star Trek The Next Generation, they had much higher quality. Of course, the low-budget, cheesy syndicated shows will still have cheesy style openings. Doesn't mean that it's a 90s style. The lesser quality shows in the early 90s had 80s style openings. If the video had said like 1990 version, okay, I'd let them get away with that, but 95, that's clearly inaccurate. Now, I've already heard people refer to the segment at the start of this episode as 90s style, but clearly the show that this opening takes the most inspiration from is Full House, which aired from 1987 to 1995. Now, one could argue the majority of the show aired in the 90s. It did start in the 80s, and it took its style cue from that decade, and even the seasons that aired in the 90s were still 80s style. And how I know this opening sequence was 80s style is because Alf appeared in it, and later in the episode we learned someone near Elliot's room was watching Alf, which is why it got incorporated into his dream and what his whole dream sequence was based off of. And Alf strictly was an 80s show. So I don't care what anyone says, this opening segment was 80s style. But I'm quiping over semantics here. Sorry for the tangent, but I had to get that off my chest. Anyway, getting into the 80s style opening, I had a love-hate relationship with it. I kind of liked it, thought it was brilliant by showing Mr. Robot style into an 80s sitcom. It did get kind of old after a while, and I think it went on for way too long, and it turned from being a cool stylistic choice to a pretentious indulgence where it was obvious the showrunners simply wanted to play around with making their show an 80s sitcom rather than actually telling a story. So as I said, I get the point they were making with the sequence on this was Mr. Robot protecting Elliot from the beating that he was getting. I just think they took it too far, as it didn't actually move the story forward in any way. I get that they slipped in some metaphors, like how fucked up Elliot's mom is, and Tyrell Wellick being in the trunk was a metaphor for Mr. Robot keeping what happened to him secret from Elliot. And Angela working at the E-Corp gas station was about how they can't trust her because she works for E-Corp now. And Gideon's death was to show Elliot still feels guilty about his death. But none of this was information we didn't already have, and all these things were rather contrived and just a way for the showrunners to have an excuse to do this little sequence that just went on for far too long. That being said, I did find it pretty funny, and it was really cool that they incorporated Alf into this sequence. So let's get to the point of Elliot's story. When he wakes up, Ray tells him the story of when his dog died, and the obvious metaphor was just a way for Ray telling him that he owns him now, and that the beating was just a way to convey this and make sure he knows that Ray is now his master. And then later, when Ray's goons have Elliot moved, Elliot hugs Mr. Robot and thanks him as he realized the pain that he was spared from. And this I actually really liked, and I found really interesting, as we've already seen Elliot come to terms with the fact that he'll have to learn to live with Mr. Robot, but here we actually see him appreciating Mr. Robot and seeing the benefits to having him there. So I found it interesting. However, it did very little to push the story with Ray forward, and this story and on itself seems like a side plot that's kind of distracting from the main plot. So, a forward motion that we did get in this episode was the aftermath of the shooting in China, as we see how it affected E-Corp, with Price trying to get government bailouts, which are no longer viable to public opinion about the shooting, and that Minister Jung, aka White Rose, is no longer taking Price's calls. So it makes it obvious to me that this was part of his goal in doing the shooting, was to undermine E-Corp. However, I did hear an interesting theory that perhaps his ultimate goal is to destroy the U.S. economy, and by E-Corp going down, the whole U.S. economy would go down, and perhaps that's why he helped perpetrate these hacks in the first place, and this is just the second step in order for the U.S. Economy to crash. That way it would benefit China. The other goal becomes apparent in the scenes with the Piro, where we see that the FBI investigation into the hack becomes severely hindered by the attack, and while she can see that was plainly the whole point of the attack, officially the FBI are treating it as unrelatable. In fact, she had to fight to stay on duty so that she could continue the investigation. So his defeat wasn't quite as complete as he would have hoped. But to give another example of what I was talking about with this episode taking far too long to relay basic information, we get another pointless scene with the Piro and the convenience store owner, or whatever kind of store that is, about how he's losing his business, which is basically just there to show that the economy sucks after the hacks, which we have already seen on multiple occasions. However, at the heart of the episode, and by far the most interesting parts, was the storyline with Angela and attempting to set up a device that would allow Darlene and the others to hack the FBI. But again, all the scenes we got with Mobley training her went on for far too long and were mostly unnecessary. However, the basic hack was still really exciting, and it's cool that they gave it a typical 70s heist type style. with the handheld moving cinematography and the 70s disco music. It felt very much like the film Jackie Brown to me, and I really liked these scenes. But I am wondering, since Angela was spotted on that floor by the guy who was hitting on her, once the FBI learns that they've been hacked, won't she be suspect number one? And does Angela plan on going on the date with the guy that she had arranged? Because if she doesn't, I'd imagine that would make him incredibly suspicious. And although I did get why she's helping Darlene, it still seems like a rather massive, sudden character change for her, because she was totally on Team E Corp at the start of the season, and now all of a sudden she's helping Darlene undermine them. So rather herky-jerky to me. And then the storyline ends with the cliffhanger of the Peru interrupting her before she can finish enacting the hack. And I know that the Peru doesn't know Angela is involved, and the questions she wants to ask are just innocent ones, because that's the pattern this season has set. All the cliffhangers that seem to be leading to something interesting end up leading to nothing. And I can tell this is just more misdirection here. So then the episode ends with a boring flashback to Elliot as a kid when he first learns his father has cancer, and he reveals he bought a computer store and says Elliot can name it. And I just knew that this episode would cut to black before young Elliot actually said the words Mr. Robot. That was beyond obvious. As for Mr. Robot being a term that came from Elliot in the first place, well, that's somewhat interesting, but it's not that big of a deal, and ultimately this flashback seemed kind of pointless, and most certainly was a very weak way to end the episode. So my rating for Master Slave out of 10 is a 5 average. This episode wasn't all bad. The 80s sitcom segment was entertaining, and the high storyline was pulled off really well, and it was suspenseful, and we got some really interesting revelations with White Rose and why he did the shooting, and Elliot's relationship to Mr. Robot, and how Ray feels he now owns Elliot, which begs the question, how will he get out of this? But ultimately, this episode took way too long to get these points across and came off as incredibly self-indulgent from the showrunners who were more interested in style rather than substance. So that's it for my review of Master Slave. I want to announce that this Monday, 4 p.m. West Coast time in the US, I will be doing a discussion video with my brother Apkin Tomko from the channel of the same name, where we will be discussing the first half of Season 2 of Mr. Robot. Those familiar with our channels will know that we've done a ton of these discussion videos for Game of Thrones before, and have decided to do a couple for Mr. Robot. One at the midway point through the season on his channel, and one at the end of the season on my channel. So be sure to check that out as we talk about how the season has gone so far and our theories on where we think it may go from here. I'll put a link in the description below for that video. Also be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of Mr. Robot, and be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.